Good evening. I'm Peter Schoonmaker, president of ILAHI, and on behalf of our board and sponsors, welcome to the third event in the 2011 ILAHI Lectures, Innovation for Public Good. I want to thank our board, volunteers, local organizations, and ILAHI Society members for their support. And we have a couple of announcements. Our next speaker, Michael Pollan, will be speaking at the Child Center at the University of Portland, so not here, on April 16th, Saturday, April 16th. You just show your series pass. They give you a pass to get in, and you're in. We'll have a reception, a quick reception downstairs afterwards, from which then we head out to get serious libations. We're happy to see so many of you here tonight, given the change of date from Wednesday to Monday, and we did send out emails and postcards and even called people that don't provide their email addresses for some weird reason. And we even tweeted on our, yes, we tweeted. We have 4 Twitter followers. No, we have 5. We have, yeah. There are invertebrates that have more Twitter followers than us. I know this because I checked. You know, it's kind of, it just creeps us out, first of all, that we have these 5 followers, because that's more like having stalkers. You know, when you have 1,700 followers or something, it's not, you don't worry about the stalking part. So, you know, we're thinking, since Twitter is, it's kind of the province of attention deficit disorder, terminal narcissists, that we may limit our followership to 10. You know, and make it like an exclusive club, which could take us years to reach that number at this rate. And what we're thinking is, like, if a super cool person signs up, like after we get to 10 in a couple of years, then we would boot like the least cool person on the list to include that person, so that we only have higher status individuals. And so we end up with, like, just royalty and venture capitalists, kind of like, you know, the self-appointed cool. So this year we're searching for solutions, and we're looking at the concept and practice of innovation. And our first speaker, Roger Pilkey, gave us a sense of just how far our walk is from our talk, and our second speaker, Alan Atkinson, you know, he gave us some strategies for motivating individuals and organizations to start walking. And now we're going to pull back a little bit, and we're going to look at the innovation ecosystem and how we can intervene in that system that really needs to be shaken up. Our guide tonight is one of the most prominent scientists in global agriculture, Richard Jefferson. And after a role as a senior molecular biologist at FAO, in 1991 he founded the nonprofit social enterprise Cambia to democratize science-enabled innovation. Dr. Jefferson then founded the Biological Open Source Initiative, a patent-based commons, and the Patent Lens, the world's leading nonprofit patent search and analysis site. In 2009, with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Lemelson Foundation, Richard became professor of science, technology, and law at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia, where he leads the initiative for open innovation. And as you'll see, Richard Jefferson generates like an idea a minute. In fact, just this morning, we were having coffee with his good friend and board member, Susan Bragdon, and we came up with this really important new peer-reviewed publication idea, the Journal of Research Failure. So we'll be expecting that inaugural issue out probably never, because it's the Journal of Research Failure. But we're looking forward to rejecting a lot of submissions and telling them that your failed research has failed to make the cut in our journal. So please welcome Richard Jefferson.
Thank you very much. I had only met Peter for the first time today, and I didn't think he was going to be really funny until now. It was really good. I'm also particularly honored to be here. I was very attracted to his earlier work on resource management, and I came here and realized he's been working on resource management. And I got very confused. I thought it was animals and racehorse management, and I had to rewrite my entire presentation away from veterinary medicine. So this is the first time in a long time I've performed in a church, and I thought I'd start with an anecdote about my 9-year-old daughter, Tanja. Our family is, how to put it subtly, is not really very religious. Sorry. So one day, my wife Ozma and I and Tanja and some guests were sitting down at the table, and we're just about to tuck in, and she says, I think we should say grace first. Well, it's one of those, parenting moments. You think, what do we do? Do we, okay, roll with it. And so she had us hold hands and bow our heads, and we're thinking, how this could go either of two ways. And she said, I want to thank Charles Darwin for our meal, because he let us understand biological evolution, by which all of our food has come to be. And I was just sheets of relief coming off me. And it's become a tradition pretty much every evening. She chooses somebody else. She's lately got into really prominent women science leaders, and she got very, very fond of science leaders like Susan Hockfield, the president of MIT. Somehow MIT has gotten in her mind, and she's really, really excited to have heard that the president of MIT was a woman. She has a special savings account, her MIT fund. And so she had this one time. I want to thank for Susan Hockfield for running MIT, which is a really great place. And it starts like this. So it's come to really be something, even with leftovers, to look forward to. But the reason I wanted to start with that anecdote is actually because I want to start tonight's discussion about innovation systems and actually points that we could intervene and change the innovation system in a constructive way with evolution. Because in fact, everything we do in society related to innovation is actually in some way a reflection, either conscious or unconscious, of the ultimate innovation system, which is the living system that we all are nominally a response to, and that's evolution. It turns out that if you look at economic systems that we enjoy, that we endure right now, most of them reflect a particular take on evolution. For many years, over 150 years really, actually this year 150 years, social Darwinists would use competition and nature red in tooth and claw as a justification for a very rapacious form of capitalism and a rapacious form of innovation and economic development. And for many, many years, this was well justified, and actually fairly accurately justified, according to the lights of the time, by reflecting how nature in fact behaved. And if nature behaves that way, then we as products of nature really ought to behave that way too, and it should give rise to the same degree of prosperity that a successfully evolved entity, a tribe, a species, a deme would exhibit. Well, it turns out that Darwin was actually right, and most people after Darwin who interpreted and exposited about him were probably wrong. And so what I'll do is start by describing how the last 100 years of evolutionary discussion has been inadequate, and some would even say wrong, and that has misled us into understanding or misunderstanding the way that evolutionary systems really can inform economic, social, and innovative development options. So let's start with Darwin. What I'm going to do is describe to you, this is the first chance I've had an opportunity to bring together the last 30 years of my thinking as a biological scientist on one hand and as an innovation system thinker or designer on the other. And I used to think I've had maybe 3 or 4 really good ideas in my life, and that's not a bad number. And then fairly recently I realized I've actually only had one, but it was manifest in a lot of different fields, and now they've come to roost, as chickens will do. What I'd like to do then is talk about biological evolution and a new theory of evolution called the hologenome theory of evolution. And we'll come to that. And it's going to start with a very interesting observation made by a forgotten thinker in evolution. After Darwin published his work and people began to exposit the values of this as a way of building societies and arguing ferociously, the concept of competition became so dominant in our discourse that virtually any alternative discussion was not considered at all. But in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there was an extraordinary thinker His name is Pyotr Kropotkin. Show of hands, anyone's heard of Kropotkin? Oh, where but Portland do you hear of anarchists? This is great. Thank you. Pyotr Kropotkin was actually that rarest of Russian nobility. He was actually a real prince of Russia who gave it all up to be an anarchist. Now, this is a real fall. Like the current administration, for instance, we once had aspirations for them, too. Oh, come on, that was supposed to be a clincher in Portland. All right. Okay, so Kropotkin was quite disturbed by what he saw as being a limited understanding of Darwin's theory of evolution being promoted, both as biologist, which he also was, and as a social systems thinker, which he very much was. And he began to spend a substantial chunk of his life, I think it later on was 12, 15 years, wandering around Siberia, intentionally, to look at the natural history of living systems that existed there. And he later on collected his works in a published work called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, in which he proposed that actually cooperation and collaboration were the largely neglected and, in fact, perhaps dominant force that gave rise to performance in natural selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection was not actually, in his view, wrong, but the proposal for how it worked was completely misleading, that it wasn't simply a matter of competition, but it was actually selection at the level of community action. His work was beautifully written. It was not highly polemical. It was well researched and well considered, and so it was largely forgotten for almost 100 years. It was exacerbated by the fact that he was seized as a mascot by the burgeoning Bolsheviks, who then used him as a justification for what went on to become the Soviet Union. And so, even though as an anarchist he actually didn't like communism any more than he liked capitalism, he ended up being marginalized, and his thinking was largely marginalized because it was used to associate and justify a particular totalitarian form of government that was neither fish nor fowl in his thinking. So if you were to go back and get this book, which makes for a very good read, in fact, even though he's Russian, he actually wrote it and published it in English because he was in his permanent sabbatical in the UK, having been banished. You give up your royalty. This is one of the consequences is going to Kent. Anyway, I used to live in the UK, and this would have been hell. Okay, so Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. It's out of copyright, free for downloads. You can get it on any of the usual iPad tools. And it makes a good read, because what he described was fascinating, that in a situation in which the environment itself is a compelling challenge to exist within, it wouldn't be competition with your peers that would determine your success. It would be your ability to persist and perform in a hostile or difficult environment. And very often, his observations supported, that would be done through the mediation of cooperative action. And that cooperation amongst individuals could effect a sustainable, long-term performance dividend, whereas the lack of such cooperation would cause that to be evanescent and transient, and that doesn't lead to evolutionary persistence. Now, his argument is fascinating, and to this day is probably underappreciated, but only recently have we begun to have a mechanism by which this actual observation has teeth. As a molecular biologist, I spent much of my early career throwing things in blenders and doing the chimpanzee typewriter thing, trying to rebuild an understanding of a living system, having just dissolved it. Well, fascinating. If you were to take one of Susan Bragdon's dogs, for instance, and throw it in a blender, which would be a very welcome event for me, if not Susan, and certainly not for the dog. Well, actually, no, let's personalize this more. If one of you were chucked in a blender, because I don't want to get in trouble, if one of you were tucked in a blender, the traditional, neo-traditional wisdom of the modern scientist is that the DNA that would emerge would be your DNA, and it would be mostly the product of your chromosomes and those that you've derived from your parents. And there's an element of that that's quite true. You know, people have said for over a decade now that we've sequenced the human genome. It turns out we haven't, because what comes out in the blender is actually the genetics of you. But most of it, the vast majority of it, is in little bags called bacteria. The vast majority of you is not encoded by the chromosomes that we've long since have thought as the human genome. Not at all. It's encoded by microbes. Not just a few, and not just opportunistic pathogens, but by billions and billions with thousands of species making up what amounts to cloud genetics. So you are actually a fairly, someone say, of course you are, nebulous, vague, and that is what you are. You are not the product of your chromosomes per se, at least the ones you used to think of as chromosomes. You are the product of a suite of individuals, many of them, which form the basis of your performance in the natural system. And let me give you an example of that. This year marks, besides I think the 150th anniversary of Darwin's publication of Origin of Species, it also marks the 50th anniversary of the release of the birth control pill. Now, for many years I used to study a phenomenon, an enzyme that actually metabolizes particular compounds in the intestines of vertebrates. And this is encoded by microbes, by bacteria. And I used to study this quite a bit, and I started to wonder, what does it do, this enzyme? I mean, it was fun to study, and usually you don't push the issue of why. But I started asking myself that and discovered something fascinating. And this goes back to the birth control pill, which was also fascinating. And that was that in the original test cases, when this was evaluated for its efficacy and its safety, there was one group of women, because they generally tested women in this, that became reproducibly pregnant. And those women had a common feature, and that was that they were on antibiotics. They were using antibiotics. And to this day, oral contraception and antibiotics are contraindicated. You shouldn't have them at the same time. What's fascinating is that the reason for that, also I discovered in the course of my own research 30 years ago, was a pretty compelling example of why the interpretation of Darwin's theory was so inadequate. Turns out that if you were a classic Darwinist, you would probably say that the most strongly selected traits under natural selection would be fertility, whether you leave progeny at all, fecundity, how many, and mate choice, who you choose to have them with. And those, any classic evolutionary theorist would say, those are the most driven, embedded human traits. So those are going to be the ones that are just locked down, absolutely sealed in amber in the chromosomes. Well, this birth control experiment was rather fascinating because it turns out that if you were to measure the circulating hormones in your body, or Susan's dog's body, at any given time, and let's say you take an oral dose of something, it turns out that the levels would go up and start to come down again after that dose, but then would come up again and go down, come up again, go down, come up again, go down, so. And it would continue like that for quite a long time, and the actual time underneath the overall curve at which you had a high level of this steroid hormone was really pretty high. But it turns out if you were on antibiotics, you go up and flat line after that, go right back down. I'm looking at this, and it turns out that the reason for that is because the bacteria in the upper intestine are there. They're part of us. When you take this drug, it comes up, our body, or what we think of as our body, part of our body says, basta così, enough. And it puts a sugar on it, and it sticks it out in the upper intestine, which then says, food. The bacteria then take the sugar off, metabolize it. The rest of it is reabsorbed back in. And the body says, I've seen you before, sends it out, boom. And the bacteria says, I've seen you before, sends it back in. And it turns out that there's this hysteresis, this cycling back and forth, that actually determines the lifetime of these compounds in the blood. And that's because of the endogenous microbes in our body. In the absence of those microbes, it goes up and down. And I found this to be utterly fascinating. But if the genes that do this, which are the genes that I actually first made my reputation on, were actually encoded in bacteria, but they were conducting the capability that allowed a human or a frog or a dog to actually produce steroid hormones, the estrogens, the testosterone, any of these things, at a suitable level to have biological activity, does that then mean that that's really a human gene in a bag called a bacterium? Darwinists would say that that's an intensely selected trait, but it's all wrapped up in a bag called a bacterium in my intestine. So does that mean then that we as a species have outsourced a lot of our capabilities into little bags in little places? And it actually does. But like any firm that outsources, and you're going to see where all this is going to be tied together, is basically part of an ecosystem itself. You can't sort of say, well, okay, we won't source any of that stuff. It's all part of what makes the firm perform. In our case, the performance was fertility. But then the mate choice, that's where it gets really interesting. It turns out that a lot of the scientists who observe these things are in the private sector because they have skin in the game. If things fail, they have to know about it. So Colgate-Palmolive, in their ever persisting search for a better deodorant, noticed that if they actually inhibited a particular enzyme, they found that people, I assume that they did it on people. I don't know if you'd test it on rabbits. A rabbit doesn't smell to me, Bob. So how would you do that, And I've always admired that, in shampoo, this should be very popular locally. I'm sure I'll get run out of town. But, when you read a shampoo and it says not tested on animals, you just think there's a little subtext. You're the first. Tell, right? Call the right. How does it feel at 1-800-OW? It's just an aside. It has nothing to do with the talk. So Colgate-Palmolive discovered that there was a particular enzyme, which, luck would have it, is the same enzyme that produces the testosterone and the estrogens inside our upper intestine, but it's in the skin. And it turns out that when we drop the person, the dog, whatever, in the blender, we get about 100 times as many genomes of microbes. Well, many of them are on the epidermis. They're in your hair, your skin, your nostrils. They're everywhere anything can be, and a lot of places you didn't imagine anything could be. And they are doing the things that make you you. And it turns out that includes body odor, because most of mate choice is determined, interestingly enough, by either the attraction or repulsion, what a surprise, of a candidate party. Well, most of that is affected by androstenols, which are volatile steroid hormones. Well, they're not volatile when our body, what we used to think of as our body, makes them. They're excreted in the axils, which is a nice way of saying armpits and leg pits, but I've never heard anybody use the expression leg pits before. But you got a leg pit, and there's stuff coming out of it that doesn't smell at all until the microbes win their magic ways. And they do, and that releases the aroma that causes you to be so attracted to somebody else. So when Colgate-Palmolive discovered this, they thought, well, if we inhibit the bacterial enzyme that makes this thing, we won't have body odor. And, they were right. And it works. It really works. But it turns out that if mating choice is also determined by the bacteria, and fertility is determined by the bacteria, what would Darwin say about any of this? He'd say, well, then those traits are part of the complex that is selected under natural selection. But wait, they're not from mom and dad, are they? It turns out that this is where it starts to get really exciting, because it kind of is. And the U.S. National Institutes of Health, which is one of the, there's not a lot of big bureaucracies that I love. No, there's one big bureaucracy I love, and it's the NIH. The NIH is, to my view, the most exciting, important organization in the history of humankind, because it has avoided the parochial that bureaucracies migrate towards. And they do some incredible things. And one of the things they're doing is called the Human Microbiome Project, where they, unlike getting Craig Venter to volunteer his DNA, and you know that he was first in line anyway, they're actually taking presumably anonymous volunteers and dividing them into little bits and sequencing all the microbes that are there. This is presumably voluntary. But it turns out that there's thousands and thousands of species, most of which have never made it onto a petri dish. Thousands of species and thousands of variants of each of these species. And they're everywhere. There's a lung microbiome, there's a skin microbiome, but there's a foot microbiome that's different than a hand microbiome. There's a hair microbiome, there's an upper intestinal, lower intestinal microbiome. Everywhere you can think of, there's an entire population of microbes. And they're not just waiting for Godot. They are us. They are doing the things that make us work or not work. They are us. Bugs are us, backward R. And the fascinating things about that is that we have always thought of ourselves in a unitary fashion, or Unitarian fashion. We've always thought of ourselves as unique individuals. Unless you see the Life of Brian. You're all individuals. We're all individuals. This is a Monday night thing, I guess. Have you not been to the bar yet? Okay, I'm not. Both Monty Python fans in Portland. I can see what you said. Okay, now, Portland's a hard crowd. Okay, so here's the shtick that's going to go into the second part of my talk about innovation systems. We have always thought of ourselves as unitary individuals. There's something so me about me, and there's something so you about you, but the idea that we are you and I are the thing sounds very much like a song, but it doesn't sound practically real as a scientist, but it turns out it is. So how do these microbes come and go? Well, if you've shaken anyone's hand, if you've partaken of food at their home, if you so much as sneezed in their company, if you have in fact grown up at all. And again, Portland. So it's you have been exposed to legions of opportunity. You can think of these as clambering little capabilities, dying to be part of the hive mind that is you. But the interesting thing is they're not associated with you. They are you, as much as your parental chromosomes. When the idea of nature versus nurture was proposed, it was an artificial distinction. There is no nature versus nurture because nature and nurture basically are two faces of the same coin. Our capabilities to perform in natural systems are because we have acquired and developed these capabilities that are encoded by microbes that have allowed complex, resilient systems to form. And this is where I want to take it to the next level of interest that's talking about the hologenome theory of evolution, which is actually a theory I developed around these ideas about 20 years ago and in my usual way have never written about, except in a blog, and other than the 4 people who've been following the Twitter account, who also are on my blog roll. You could be one of the first to know about it. The hologenome theory basically says that the natural selection has operated at the level of a community, and that community is comprised mostly of a scaffold genome, which is what we used to think of as the human genome that was sequenced by Craig Venter in competition with the public sector, and yada, yada, yada. That's the human genome, and the myriad genomes that actually make the human genome, and the selection occurs at that complex community level, and that the performance of the unit, the holobiome or the holobiont, is actually what determines performance under natural selection. Now, what's interesting about the hologenome theory is that it's testable, which is always nice in a theory, though kind of discomforting if it doesn't work, but it is testable, and it's also built upon observations that are extraordinarily timely, because it's only in the last few years we've begun to understand the nature of these myriad microbes, many of them bacteria, but other types of microbes as well, as anything other than opportunistic passengers in our life. As purveyors of capability, of real traits, we hadn't previously understood how important they are, and now we're beginning to. But let's extrapolate beyond Susan's dog or you and I and look at the real ecological systems that exist out there. It turns out that there is no reason to think throughout the entire history of evolution that there has ever been selection at the level of an individual genome. And we used to think bacteria were single-celled bacteria. We talk about them all the time because you can get colonies, which of course have about 1 billion bacteria even on a petri dish. And we assumed that it came from a single cell. But that wasn't how it ever existed in nature. Biofilms and complex communities, even of bacteria, are the natural system which is selected for its performance under evolution. So if that's the case, and at no point in natural selection has that selection manifest itself on a single genome, but only on community, how can we extrapolate from that to something far more exciting? Well, let's look at what performance. You know, we often talk about fitness, or you hear evolutionary biologists talk about fitness. That's a very unfortunate term in many ways because it has that sort of testosterone-laden, you know, slay the buffalo, do the thing, the fitness. But there's more than that. You can actually talk about its performance, which actually in the land of Nike and Columbia is another story. But let's talk about the performance of a system. And what is performance? Well, one of the ways to discuss performance is as persistence of the system over time and its ability to maintain the system in which it persists. There's a lot of cysts in there. Persistem. Oh, that's a cool word, persistem. Yes. So if you look at persistence and performance of a biological system, that's much the same as the definition of sustainability, but you realize that that actually is where long-term selection has occurred in living systems. And if we now say, well, what makes it persistent? It's going to be resilience and networks. And this is where it starts to get really interesting and exciting from the point of view of innovation systems and changing the world in a positive way. Almost any monolithic system is fragile, whether it's a monoculture in agriculture, whether it's large financial institutions that haven't laid out their risk properly. Any large monolithic entity is intrinsically very, very fragile. There's a lot of exposure and risk associated with it, and that risk has very few mitigating circumstances. What makes a system very robust and resilient is networks, and those networks have to be content-related networks. The thing that matters in a network isn't the node of a network, the thing. It matters the transactions that make a network strong. So if you look at classical complex systems analysis, if you can talk about something that's only 15, 20 years old as classical, you'll find that a node in a network that has many connections and is generative, that is, it can throw up new opportunities in whatever capacity, if it's a circuit, if it's a neuron, if it's a component of a complex ecosystem, if it can elaborate many different forms of its role, it has the opportunity to form many different junctions and to transmit information across those junctions. And that's what makes the system so staggeringly resilient, because if one of these ceases to function, other forms can make it. And that's how neural adaptation works, and that's how complex systems work. What is known, and this is an absolute incontrovertible fact, is that resilience comes from complexity, and complexity has to be joined through transactional networks. So these resilient networks are the means by which performance and persistence occurs. What's interesting about that is that also is a brilliant ex post justification why most of living systems are microbes, because it's the fastest way to gain new capability. I mean, my generation time is about 45 years. That's really slow. So let's imagine that I want my daughter to evolve to be doing something different than I did when I was born in 1956. Well, if she's waiting for my genes to evolve so that she can get better, it's just really unlikely. But on the other hand, 45 years, that's so slow. But how fast are my microbes evolving? Well, first of all, it's not just the mutations within the microbes, it's the combinations. How fast am I changing microbes? Every day. Thousands and thousands of different permutations of these microbes that articulate new capabilities within my body, within my ability to metabolize my food. If you think about it, people who talk about human interaction with food are missing the point unless they realize that the human is mostly microbes, because you don't intersect with anything in the environment except maybe light that hasn't passage through microbes first. You don't intersect with a bit of food, nothing in touch, even sound, without being mitigated by the microbial constituents that make you, you. What's fascinating about that is that that's the opportunity for change. It's incredible how fast microbial constitutions can change. And the capabilities are not just fertility and fecundity, but they're pretty much everything that make us what we are around the scaffold. So if I want my daughter to be different, or if I'm a rice plant that wants is a really tough word here, where an opportunity arises for the next plant to persist better than I do, what better way to develop it than to alter the microbiome that makes it perform under the selective conditions? Okay, so if this is the case, and give me this until the Q&A period, or after the Q&A period when we can go somewhere, libations? If you can imagine how resilient a natural ecosystem is when it's got many, many information exchanging nodes, and each of these has a generative capability. Now let's fast forward to the current situation we have socially. And this is where, as I say, 30 years of my life have come together. I started Cambia, actually, it's funny I should be here in Oregon about this, because 25 years ago, I tried to launch Cambia here in the state of Oregon and failed abysmally. So I went off and did it elsewhere and failed less abysmally. The idea behind the institution that I founded and have run into the ground is that you have an opportunity to do something that is socially very valuable, not by fixing problems, but by reducing the barriers to other people fixing problems. My view from a social point of view is that the most sustainable intervention is one where everyone has skin in the game. If every human being who experiences a problem has a stake in its solution, that builds sustainability into the equation. And when I started in molecular biology back in the 70s, the idea was, which was just laden with the hubris that I was just alluding to, maybe it was the testosterone thing, was that we could fix things. Don't worry, we'll fix it. We're scientists. We're here to help. And we could genetically engineer stuff. And we could, and we still can, and it's a lot of fun, but it's not very resilient, it turns out. So I started working on developing technology, and I became aware that as a scientist, I was a really good scientist at my best, but I wasn't really into discovery-based science. I found it much more satisfying to work on inventions. I love to invent. So for the last 35, 40 years of my life, I've really been an inventor. I just used the biological systems as my crucible. And what was fascinating about that was the observation, which is anything but selfless, that if you provide a tool to other people, and it works, and it fits their hands and their needs, and they go off and do things with it, it's a rush. There is nothing more satisfying than watching people take something you've invented and go off and do new things with it. Anyone who tells you that it's selfless to help people is missing the boat. It's a rush. But there's nothing more exciting than have them do it in ways you can't control, because then it has a life of its own. It has generativity. So my obsession from early days was, if we have huge problems in social equity, and we sure do, if we have huge problems in agriculture and food production and watershed management and all these things, which we sure do, don't you think what we should do is provide a toolkit, or help provide toolkits that have local scale validity and use characters, and make those available with as few strings as possible so people can take that ball, move it forward, and create a whole local game with it. And so that was the premise. And that was sort of my Chicken Little time in early days of biotechnology, when I was saying, well, really, we don't have to do it this way. If we could just have an institution or an idea where you invent the new tools and let them have a life of their own, people will solve their own problems. And the response I just had from you was the same one I had then. Which is like stunned mullets. And then you'd hear people say, we can fix that problem. Oh, God, as soon as I heard that, I just knew I was in for a long haul. Everybody wants to fix somebody else's problem so they can abstract a piece of the value. It's kind of natural, until you realize that the piece of the value can be how you feel. Then it becomes a little more interesting about the idea of enablement. So the idea of setting up an institution whose explicit goal was to disrupt the status quo by allowing more and different people to solve more and different problems their own way was really a little bit before its time. So we spent years and years trying to develop the concept, inventing technologies where, well, for instance, I did the first, okay, this is sort of like a mea culpa thing. I did the first, yeah, but if I could turn this Celestial Seasonings tea into the real stuff. I did the first genetic engineering of a plant a long time ago. And we did the first field release of transgenic crops, and it was done in the Plant Breeding Institute in Cambridge in 1987, and it was, by accident I discovered, it was one day before Monsanto did their field trial of transgenic food crops. One day, and we didn't know about it until a year later, and when I was giving a talk at a different kind of venue than this, and I had hair and stuff, and I was given my slides, and I had, you know, anybody remember slides? They were called Diazo slides. It was the fashionable way to do slides. It was blue and white instead of black and white, you know, and it was made on things. And mine went up there and had little hairs and stuff on it, and it had the date, June 1st, 1987, field trial of transgenic potatoes here, run by the public sector in Cambridge, England. And the guy right before me had actually been a really well-groomed guy without much hair that didn't appreciate that it was just a time thing. I'll get you, kid. And he's from Monsanto, and he had to show the world's first field trial of a transgenic food crop, tomatoes, June 2nd, 1987. I thought, oh, wow, how cool. But it was the last time the public sector ever beat the private sector at something really substantive. And what happened was that we did this trial at a public institution, which later on Maggie Thatcher's government privatized, with the explicit goal not of fixing a problem, but asking some fundamental questions. How do genes work in the field? How does one potato look like another potato? If these are genetically similar potatoes, do they behave similarly? Which would have been a sensible question to ask, and we did. So we set out to ask questions about it, and we realized something fascinating, and that was that we couldn't ask the right questions. The technology was too primitive. We ended up asking the questions we could ask, not the questions we should ask. And the technology, the nature of the technology and the nature of the social adoption of the technology is what limited that. It turned out that in our institute, at that time, we were surrounded by really good agronomists, plant breeders, people who really understood field biology in a substantive way. And then on the other side of the institute was the molecular geneticists. And we'd chuck stuff into blenders, and we'd invent new recombinant DNA technology that was very, very cool. But these not very cool people that integrated vision that would take 10 or 15 years into their worldview were not part of the equation. They weren't part of our problem-solving metaphor. They weren't part of our development agenda. So we asked the questions that we could ask with the cool new technology instead of walking down the hall to the places that was these old guys and saying, so what should we be asking? Or what kind of questions would be great to ask an agronomist or a plant breeder, how this performs over 4 or 5 generations in that field? Because the answer would have been that you guys aren't up to to the task, and nobody wants to hear that. So we did what we could do. We're like dogs licking ourselves because we could. And so we did a lot of really cool genetic engineering, and some people made huge industries out of it. But it's basically really dumb. It's not bad or anything. It's just not very smart. I guess that makes it dumb. Yeah, okay. So the point is, it doesn't change very much, and life does. Living systems, even agricultural systems, change on a moment-to-moment basis. Any farmers amongst you will know that whether it's organic or chemical agriculture, you turn your back on it for a season and you've got a field of weeds. It requires management and lots and lots and lots of change. But when you put a huge investment in one particular genotype and one particular agronomic practice, it doesn't lend itself to change. And we know that resilience comes with the ability to adapt and moderate and change and form alternative ways of articulating function. We know that. So what we were locking ourselves into was technically dumb, but also we observed socially dumb. That is, we didn't talk to the people who had a lot of life experience about real world systems. We didn't ask them the right questions, and had we done so, which would have been noble in itself, we probably would have been able to respond to their imperative. And that's a real humbling thing, that even as good modern scientists, you just don't have the tools to respond to somebody else's wishes. The other side was that all of my postdocs and colleagues, my grad students, people working with me then at the Plant Breeding Institute, were from the developing world. They were basically being used as bench fodder, as tissue culture jocks who would generate papers for career development, and then they'd go back to their home countries, which would be all over Asia, Latin America, Africa, Poland at the time. Really smart people, dedicated, and if they were lucky, they'd get the brass ring, a paper in a major journal, and maybe a job in a air-conditioned office doing nothing really much, except maybe hoping for a sabbatical where they could get another paper out. It wasn't because they were bad people, they were wonderful people, but the tools and the general ethos of science marginalized them. So we had, at one point, a technological imperative, and another point, a social imperative. That was the majority of the people who understood or experienced the problems, they're not always the same ones, were not in the problem-solving equation that we were developing at the time. And from a technical point of view, the toolkits we were developing were basically prescriptive. They were not very adaptive. They didn't lend themselves to nimble, alternative forms of performance metric. So they were really, really cumbersome tools, even though they felt flash and new at the time. Well, they were flash and new. So they're the wrong tools, and then we discovered something else. They were all being constrained and restrained from being disseminated and from being used through intellectual property systems that were evolving at the time. So I still got about 15 minutes of your time, so now comes the segue into the last 20 years of my life. Now, this is all just a setup. So I posited that these social and technical and, as you'll see, socioeconomic issues could actually be addressed by a concerted effort. I didn't want it to be an institute because I'm a terrible manager, and all the people that have worked with me over the years will agree with me for the first time, that I'm a terrible manager. But what they decided to do, or what I decided to do, is develop an initiative that would specifically target the development of tools which would have intrinsic change ability in the tool, so people could modify it. It would be made available and ideally co-developed with people who understood the problems that they wished to solve and who had a vested interest in the solution. And then we'd develop it under a legal and normative process that allowed them to take the ball and run with it and do interesting things with it that didn't require me to be part of the equation. Now, those of you in the software, are there any engineers, software engineers in the audience? One. Oh, man. Well, please, God, you don't work for Microsoft, do you? I'm in trouble. Okay, thanks. All right. So it turns out that what we were developing was absolutely in parallel to a development that's gone on in the last 20 years in software community, in information technology, which has been called open source. And interestingly enough, what we developed and what they developed themselves were preordained by 4,000 years of technology development called agriculture. So to talk about open source, it's a flash new thing in software engineering in the last 20 years, right? People set out to say, well, wait, the engineers themselves should be able to see the source code. They should be involved in improving and designing it. They should be able to bring others into the equation to design and improve it. That should be usable in many different locations and many different settings. Well, this sounds very much like what I was aspiring to develop. But there's a fundamental difference. Software open source in software is really about engineers scratching their own itch. Most engineers who develop open source actually use it too. So they're actually co-developers of the very thing they use. But in the life sciences, whether it be developing a new drug, developing a new agricultural system, a crop, anything that's long and hard and capital intensive can't be expected to find the people who develop it are the very same ones who use it. You won't find many people who work on malaria vaccine development just dying for that shot. They're just not doing it. And you won't find any of the scientists in Ames, Iowa, just, oh man, I can't eat if I don't get this corn variety out in 12 years. It doesn't work that way. So the itch-scratching issue doesn't work. So when we developed this, we'd never heard of free and open source software. So we sort of co-developed our ideas and then discovered about 5 or 6 years ago that this was going on in parallel, and there were some normative legal tools that we could use. And that's where we suddenly found this conflation. And it wasn't because of software. It was because of the tools that software is making available to us. And this comes to how do we build an innovation ecosystem? Turns out there's a phenomenon called an innovation system. And it really exists, but it's never been built. It's been aggregated like barnacles on a boat. It's just stuff that accumulates, and anything that happens in innovation happens because this sluggish, festooned boat moves pathetically through the water, and what you come out with is innovation. The innovation we have now is slow, it's stupid, it's proprietary, and it's nowhere near as nimble and adaptable as the innovation we need to deal with a planet that's melting and a society that's in deep crisis because of inequity and lack of engagement in problem solving. It's just not enough. So what is the innovation system? It's everything ranging from the intellectual property system, which is extraordinarily complex and growing more so every day, to capital recruitment mechanisms, to risk mitigation tools, to all of the things that any business people in the audience will recognize as the normal, miserable life of due diligence. All the things you have to do as a business person to de-risk the process of putting money into something and making it work is hugely expensive, hugely cumbersome, and that's hugely solvable. So it turns out that in trying to develop an innovation ecosystem that looks something like a biological ecosystem, we have massive lessons to learn from our new understanding of the roles of complex communities to provide functionality. That is, can we develop an ecosystem with so few barriers to entry that small margin innovations can be contemplated as good business opportunities for the first time? And that's what we've set out to do. So 10 years ago, Cambia was working at the Rockefeller Foundation, and we were getting very frustrated by the public sector's comprehensive, almost pathological inability to have any concerted responsibility or morality. The public sector was, had become sort of a down-market version of the private sector, like with all the fun of trying to recruit capital and none of the risk associated with failing. And it was a terrible thing to see that public sector institutions that were taking financial support from the Rockefeller Foundation or other foundations were trying to wrap up every piece of their innovation, every piece of their observation, and call it intellectual property, and then try to monetize that piece. Now, this is where I was supposed to be half an hour ago, so this is where I'm going to tell you about probably the single biggest breakthrough in the history of economics. I kid you not. I already talked about the whole genome, so you know I'm incredibly modest. But this wasn't mine. This was a Dutch guy named Jan van Huygens Linschoten. I had a Dutch staff member who trained me in this for ages, you know, with a sputum shield, Linschoten, Linschoten, you know, pop. I used to have a windsock when I practiced it, Linschoten. So, okay, hands up all the Van Linschoten friend. There's somebody who knows? I saw a hand go up. Maybe it was just it's like Life of Brian again. Okay. What is the single biggest limit to economic development and commercialization, commerce, over the last 10,000 years? It turns out the biggest limit was the lack of maps. All aspects of human civilization emerged because we had trade. We would be able to go one place, find a thing, take it back where you come from or to another place where its value is different. That differential made economies happen. And that differential basically drove the development of civilization, trade. If you couldn't go and find something you didn't have and bring it back to where you did have it and used it, you couldn't have developed anything, even if that thing was a bison. Basically, trade, moving things across where there's differential value, drove civilization. But for countless years, the single most valuable tool in trade was not the camel, was not the sloop, it was the map. It turns out that the biggest risk mitigation tool in the history of our species has been the ability to know where stuff is. And in particular, not to know where the good stuff is, but know where the bad opportunities lie. Maps are risk mitigating tools of unprecedented power. I'll give you an example that's really, really tangible. Between about 1410 in the 1400s to 1596, precisely 1596, large-scale maritime trade, commerce, was locked down by the Portuguese and to some extent by their allies, the Catalan, Spanish. Totally locked down. It was absolutely monopolized. The trade with the Indies was monopolized by the Portuguese because they understood cartography. And they kept maps as an absolute trade secret. It was a capital offense to share a map with anyone outside of a designated few within Portugal. And that offense was actually enforced when that happened. Maps were the biggest possible risk mitigator in the history of our species. If you didn't know there were reefs, currents, if you didn't know that there were rocks and shoals, let alone continents full of things to plunder, you wouldn't invest in going there. You simply wouldn't. But once you knew they were there, or even if there was a chance that you could avoid sinking, it was worth the gamble. It was worth the investment. So what happened with these maps? Well, the Portuguese kept them locked down. No one else could go to the Indies. Very few could get to the Americas. They didn't know about Strait of Magellan. Huge numbers of expeditions were tried and failed because they didn't have the maps. And then in 1596, a hero of mine, Jan van Huygens-Linschoten, who was actually a hero because he was a software pirate. He actually was working as an employee of the Portuguese in Goa, in India, which was run by the Portuguese at the time. And he was a clever Dutch business person, and he noticed there the entire collection of Portuguese maps and portolans, charts, navigation aids, and thought, hey, the very word that came to your mind, hey. And so he took them. And he took them back to Amsterdam. And he published them. This was in no copyright. This is open access. Post-Gutenberg, before Statute of Anne, this is the real stuff. This is open access, open sourced. So he actually published it. 1596 saw the dawn of the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company and countless other competitors to the otherwise locked down trade the Portuguese had previously enjoyed. And it began the demise of the Portuguese Empire. And parenthetically, the Spanish Empire, which was piggybacked on that. And the demise was because the empire depended on excluding risk tools, the excluding others from playing in the same game. If your business model, if your innovation model is based on excluding others, you will have a limited shelf life because somebody's going to do a Linschoten. Turns out that that's where we are now. So what are the reefs, the shoals, the rocks, the currents right now? Bear in mind that for 10,000 years, it was stuff moving through physical space that made for economic development. It was stuff moving through physical space. And so if you knew what was in the physical space, you got more stuff back at lower cost. Logical. That was economic development. It's not that way anymore. Trade, it's unthinkable that you would conduct any business without maps as global public goods. You don't think twice about having maps, whether it's Google Maps or printed out maps or GPS on your dashboard. It's unthinkable that you would tolerate the risk of not knowing what's out there. And if you have a map, it doesn't predispose you to do a particular thing for it. I don't know if I give you a map of Portland, what you're going to do with it. I don't know you're going to conduct your business over there, or go to the Pearl District, or go to Stumptown. I don't know what you're going to do. It's your business. But the map lets you do it effectively with as little risk as possible. So it's not the world of stuff anymore. It's the world of ideas. The last 50 years, and especially the last 30 years, almost all of economic development is through transforming things through ideas. Often information, often stuff, but transforming it through ideas, not through space. But those ideas are rife with the same types of currents, rocks, shoals, hostile tribes, everything else, and we need the same maps as global public goods. If we're going to take any of the ideas I've been articulating this evening forward, we need global maps. And the maps tend to be, by and large, of the intellectual property system. It turns out we have evolved our homemade rocks, our homemade currents and reefs and shoals, and they are called intellectual property rights. Those same rights can also bespeak of continents and rich opportunity. So I'm not going to say it's all bad stuff. What I'm going to say is when it's obscure, it's really bad stuff. But when it's clear, like a map that says here be dragons or here not be dragons, what you do with it is your business, but it's got to be clear. So we've spent much of the last 10 years acquiring the world's intellectual property information, patent information from around the world, and synthesizing it in the only open, not-for-profit patent search facility. It's quite popular. If you type in full-text patent search in your Google bar, we're usually #1. Sometimes we're pipped to it by the U.S. Patent Office, but not usually. And that was 6 engineers and us hanging out in Australia. That's not bad, but it's a fraction of what's about to happen. What we're now doing is pooling together every patent in the world, adding rich informatic metadata, all in an open source, open access way, merging it with the work of the U.S. National Institutes of Health on public science and technology literature, with business literature, all of the very things that information gatekeepers have extracted as an enormous cost from the world, and make it available as a global public good. What we wish to do, and Lemelson Foundation has been hugely important to us in this, is to create an area in which opportunistic self-interest, which need not be a bad thing, which is locally informed and committed, can play the game. They may fail, but they have to have a shot. So this idea of developing a global platform, which amounts to a community-owned map of the ideas space. What are the dangers? Who has what rights? Who is a potentially good partner? What jurisdiction? How long do those rights last? What are the regulatory compliance issues? What are the business properties like? You know, when they send a journalist out, they say, don't come back, back when they were journalists still, until you have the W's, the who, what, where, when, ideally why. And then that's a story. Well, the same is true in business, in innovation. You have to know those things, and any business person does their due diligence. They have to know who are the players in that field. What are they doing? What's the state of the art in a technological field, in vaccines or in materials or microprocessors? So you have to know who. You have to know what. Ideally, you have to know why. That's the aspirational thing. Where are they going, and why would they see the market there? You have to know where. What are the jurisdictions? Where are the markets? You have to know when. Did they already start? Have they started next week? What's going on? Those same W's matter in innovation as much as they do in journalism. What we want to do is create an open, shared platform by which anyone, anywhere, can begin to support decisions that they themselves make about their systems. Now, to bring this back, to close the thing, and to bring it back full circle to agriculture, which I'm still passionate about, I think the future of agriculture is in biotechnology, but I don't think it looks anything like the one we have now. It's a biotechnology that's humane, it's local in scale, but it's driven by evidence, but inspired by imagination. And that imagination has to be those who actually practice agriculture. So my sense is we need desperately a massive breakthrough in performance, not necessarily yield, sometimes yield, certainly performance of agriculture, resilience, capabilities. But that performance shift is not going to come, in my view, from conventional biotechnology. It'll come from the new, exciting, scientifically rich type of biotechnology that comes from recognizing that the performance of a system is not the sum of the components of its parts. It's a much more interesting thing, and that's the nature of complex systems. So I am passionate about science, but I'm passionate about people too. And the one thing that keeps them from being together is the lack of these global maps to understand the who, what, where, when, and why. The why will be personalized. They will all determine their own why. So a small farmer in Andhra Pradesh, a small business that wants to support her, those will be determining the why. But all the other ones we should help with. And so that's happening. So the tools of information technology, of open source software, the trends in government information are all in our favor. The time is right to do this now, and after 20 years of working at it, we're about to be successful. And it's critical to not view that this is polemic without a scientific basis. This is real, dinky-die, good science. This is not, wouldn't it be nice? This isn't the Beach Boys. This is the real stuff. It can be done, and it can be done in my lifetime, or in yours. It really can. And if you start to look at the world of patents and say, oh, they're evil, stop them all, that is Beach Boys stuff. Instead, say, what is it? Does anyone really know what it looks like? Do we know what's out there? So let me close with that little homily about patents. It turns out that when the patent system was developed, the modern patent system a couple of hundred years ago, it was viewed as a tool for disclosure, for teaching the public. There were no scientific learned journals at the time in the early 1800s, and it was a very powerful tool to get your idea out. But people didn't really want to get their idea out if they could have an advantage by not getting it out. That's kind of normal, right? Why would you tell them how to make your chronometer if, they can then make it, and you can't? So there was a compromise. It was a balance of rights and responsibilities. If you tell the public about what you've invented, this new type of tempering for a spring or this new type of cotton gin, Eli, if you tell the world how you make that, so they can learn from it and they can build upon it and be inspired by it or frustrated by it and build a better one, you can have a few years in which you're the only one that can practice this. Or at least you're the only one who has the right to stop others from practicing it, but that's for another story. And it's a really good story, but you haven't eaten or drunk yet. So, but afterwards, if there's anybody interested, if there's anybody interesting in the audience, if there's anybody interested in the audience afterwards, we can have a beer and talk about it. But so the issue was there was a rights and responsibility ratio. Teach the public about this, and in exchange, you can have a limited right to exclude others. The funny thing is, over the next 200 years, everybody forgot about the responsibility part. And there we have the largest cumulative literature in the history of our species. And it's not copyrighted, and it's not in Dutch. It's out there. It's out there. We serve, now serving 75 million patent documents on Cambia's patent lens. And we're about to go live next week, again, with help from, ironically, the Gates Foundation and the Lemelson Foundation, a dramatic shift in the capabilities to search and understand patents. 75 million documents. Everything from how to make the better peanut butter sandwich and the cheesy, the speaker. Everything you can think of that we touch or eat is probably described in the world's patent literature over the last 50 years, in detail. Scathing, awful detail sometimes, but detail. So can we use the power of informatics to help turn it into sensible teachings for the community, where some of them will say, what an incredible idea, I can learn from that and I can build on that. Or, that's a terrible thing that they have the rights on that. Oh wait, they don't, which is often the answer we get. Everybody seems to assume it's a worst nightmare, but nobody has the facts. And as we start clawing those facts forward, we discover there's a lot of good news in there, a lot of teachings, and not a lot of bad news when you can see it. It's like the old thing, and this is what I'll close on. You remember it turns out the incorrect assertion that there were these old maps that used to say, Hic sunt dracones, here there be dragons. Well, of course, the more they mapped it, the more they discovered there weren't. And places where they used to say, here there be dragons, became fertile grounds to pillage. So get forth ye and pillage. What I'm trying to say is that as we push back the frontiers of ignorance, we discover that there's probably, on the whole, more opportunity than there is downside. There is nothing to be gained by railing against a system in the absence of clarity and transparency. Once we have the transparency, the railing can be meaningful. We can fix a problem when we can see it. We can't see that in the innovation system right now. We have a cumbersome, opaque, exclusionary system which makes it impossible for small creative entities to exercise their creativity well. So that's what I'll close on, and it brings it back to full circle. What is a creative entity? Is it, in fact, me in the way I used to think of myself, or is it a community? And I would posit that it is a community, and that is what we are. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I'm going to lay this Pendleton blanket on Richard. We're going to take some questions and answers. If there's you've got any like molecular genetics questions, I'm sure he'd like to. I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there that want to talk sequencing. But if you've got any other questions, seriously, we'll pop this. Even that one. No, actually, ask other questions. Don't ask that one. We'll pop this mic up, and you can ask for clarifications or how this thing's going to work.
You weren't kidding about laying a blanket.
I'm going to lay the blanket on you. I'm not kidding you. And then we'll head downstairs, grab a beverage, and then Richard's going to treat us all to a beer at Higgins.
Thank you for that. You're not.
Yeah, I'm really doing it. Yeah.
It clashes with the Hawaiian. Thank you. Thanks for this. Oh, it's made in China. Boomsy. Now they're alive. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I didn't think you saw me.
But you're ready for my response.
Yeah. So my friends call me Captain Safety. I actually drove here tonight. I wear a bike anyway.
Really good.
I just wanted to ask you, well, first of all, thank you for mentioning the corporation Nike, Columbia Sportswear, Celestial Seasonings, and on Satan, I think. Maybe someone will have a question about their patents and seeds. But my question is, I produce and moderate panel discussions with a lot of the NCAR and NOAA scientists that are experts in climate change and what that could mean to agriculture, and then aquifer depletion and what that can mean to agriculture, and glacier runoff baseline loss, and then topsoil, peak phosphorus, peak oil, peak natural gas, and pollinator loss. And so my question is, I'm all for innovation and the ideas, but each of those experts is concerned about how we're going to feed 7 billion people with just their concern alone. And when they get on these panels and look at their colleagues, they wonder even more, because a lot of those are going to be synthesized and maybe not just added, but in some ways multiplied. So I love your optimistic vision. I just heard the quote that a pessimist complains about the wind, and an optimist thinks the wind will stop, and a realist trims the sails. So you seem like a realist to me, but I'd love to hear how you would address these various experts' concerns. Thanks. And after that, I have a big question.
For a warm-up, that's really good. As you said about the planet. I guess I have a massive amount of respect and responsiveness to those experts. The challenge, of course, is most of them will agree we have, when you were saying their effect on agriculture, I think we could turn the tables a little bit about the things we can deal with. Agriculture has the single biggest effect on climate change of anything out there, in terms of water use, in terms of natural resource depletion, about employment and income generation, which causes a massive dysfunction in consumption. All of these things are being driven by agriculture. So rather than talk about the climate, which doesn't have a handle on it, there's many, many interventions we could make in systems that improve things, we can actually say, what must we deal with to really engage with climate change? And the more thoughtful of the experts that I've spoken to would agree that interventions in our agricultural systems will ultimately pay massive dividends in the consequence for climate change. And I'm confident that they're right, but I'm also confident that business as usual won't do it. The projection of 7 billion is optimistic. It's more like 9 billion by almost any sensible projection. Assuming I don't get hit by a bus, I'll probably be there to witness it. That's terrifying. There isn't a lot of extra area, and the idea that you can get blood from a stone by just putting on more fertilizer and more water when we have precious little of either of them, especially since the fertilizer generally comes from energy-intensive industries, is naive. We have to do something different. So my sentiment is that the part we haven't engaged properly to be a realist and to trim the sails, though actually I take exception to that, because the trimming of the sails does imply a moderation of response. I would say the aggressive realist figures out how to get more speed out of the boat without capsizing. And that's in a sense what involving more people in problem solving is about. Right now we defer problem solving to a self-appointed elite, and I don't think that's necessarily wise. I think we can do much better about a more inclusive problem-solving paradigm, which actually means a lot of different ways to harness the wind, just to really push the metaphor to the vague level. I agree with you. The experts are absolutely right, in my opinion, and I think we can do something about it through the intervention in problem-solving systemically. Okay. Pleasure.
Well, thanks for being here. If you had a Watson-like knowledge engine, why would you stop with patent data?
I wouldn't.
Good.
By Watson, I'd first make a killing at Jeopardy. By Watson, you don't mean of Crick and Watson. You mean like the IBM computer thing.
No, I mean one of these vast database searchers that can prioritize and...
It turns out, I think Watson is sort of a dying breed of monolithic computation as opposed to distributive computation. And, Google's employees are us. Every time we click a link, we're basically giving them metadata about the value of that click. And the same can be said about information platforms and informatics. So my professorship in this university is in 3 or 4 different faculties, and one of them is professor of information systems. And my sense is that the evolution right now towards, when I didn't use the term cloud genetics lightly, cloud computation and information systems are actually extremely exciting to me as a way of avoiding monolithic dependency on Watson or Big Blue or whatever it was. So I think looking at myriad redundant and decentralized resources informationally is the way to go. And I wouldn't stop at patents. You're exactly right. It turns out that, for instance, let's take the example of Monsanto, a company I've wrestled with for years. I like a lot of the people. I don't like a lot of the policies. So there's a company where if you were to search in the patent literature for things owned by Monsanto, you'd find a fraction of their disclosures and teachings, unless you knew that they own Calgene and DeKalb and Dada and Dada and Dada, and in every other company, every other country, the myriad companies that are part of their portfolio. And then if you knew which universities have exclusively licensed in technologies. So to understand the business data is an exciting opportunity, because here's the cool thing. All of it is public record. And we have forgotten that that means it's supposed to be for the public. So it should be a matter of a single click to understand the skein of control and rights in associated businesses other than privately held companies. So you're completely right. It's going to be business data. It's going to be capital flows, which are also a matter often of public record, but hard to find. It's scholarly literature. Right now, the open access movement is changing the face of publishing. It's a very complicated movement, but already the U.S. National Institutes of Health, yes, through PubMed Central, host 3 million full-text open access documents describing much of the biomedical literature over the last 30 years. And it's totally free in every sense of the word. Free beer, free dumb, everything. So integrating that with business literature, with patent literature, with the gray literature, which is people's ideas, people's opinions. I heard so-and-so said this, in an interesting, redundant fashion, will out-Google and out-Facebook anything out there, because, what's Facebook? Well, both the guys on your Facebook page agree. Sorry. Whoops.
Hi, I'm going to switch up the question a bit. I'm a public educator, principal of a small options high school in the Portland area, and there were many things that you said tonight that really resonated with me in the position that I'm in. One was any large institution is fragile, and I think most people in Oregon right now are very aware of our budget crisis and the fragility of the public education system. So I want you to think about that, and then also that as an educator, I feel like what you said is what I do, that I'm not fixing problems, but I'm reducing obstacles for people to help fix their own problems, to help illuminate and excite and engage in the world so that they can make the world a better place. But unfortunately, this large institution of public education is stagnant, fragile, and about to crack. So I'm wondering what sort of thoughts you might have about that. You may not have the answer. That's okay. I'm not expecting that tonight. But also on learning systems in general, because I find, and I'm not going to go too long, Peter, I promise. But I find, because I've been badgering him for years, that we should be having a series on education and learning systems, because we're stuck in a learning model that we've outgrown. And so how can your thinking about resilient systems and complex interdependent relationships apply to the way that we learn as adults and the way that we engage our young people in understanding the world around them and the complexity of the issues that will be there for them in the future, while we don't have enough money to pay for it, at least with the system that we have now?
You gave me a perfect lead-in. Can I say that first, I think that your profession is probably the most important and undervalued in the world. The next one is the next one is the librarian. The archivist of that knowledge is the other undervalued profession. And I have enormous resonance with what you say, but at the end you gave a hint towards what I hope is a solution. And you said, well, we don't have enough money to pay for it. Well, that's just it. I mean, if we have an economic development paradigm in which broad decentralized wealth creation is avoided at the expense of narrow consolidated wealth accumulation, then of course we don't have the liberal capital to reassort into public education. What we need is a robust economic system that is prosperous, where there's many small, medium enterprises that can contribute both in tax dollars as well as in the ethos of the community and the vibe, because you'd appreciate probably more than anybody that the emotional and cultural expectation of a child will determine their success in education. And that's going to be impacted by their local community. If they are positive about their economic and personal prospects, it will make that child receptive to your skills. There's no doubt about that. So ultimately, I think that the solution, if there is one, and if I dare to say something like this, is going to be through a broad decentralized economic development paradigm in which many people have ownership, in every sense of the word, to wealth creation. That means, in my view, small-medium enterprise. I am passionate about the power of small-medium enterprise to form a robust tax base and to form a robust cultural basis for education. So I think that's if there is a solution, that's going to be it. And I think whatever solutions come, that will be a required piece of it, because you can't do it without money. You can be more efficient at how you spend the money you do have, but ultimately we have a dysfunctional wealth creation system, and that's what innovation systems are about. So I think that, I mean, this is, patting myself on the back, saying the thing that I'm obsessed with is ultimately, I hope, going to impact the thing that you do. And I need that for my own daughter, because she goes to public schools as well, and we depend on the culture and the vibe and the communications. But what I don't think, just to parenthetically say, personally, is that the idea of information should be equated with knowledge, and that should not be equated with wisdom, and the availability of Twitter, Facebook, everything else, and let's just get it quick on Google because I don't actually know anything, I think it's missing the enormous importance of the complexity of systems. And most of the complexity is in emotional and face-to-face interaction. And I cannot personally emphasize enough how I think human-scale interaction, emotive interaction, cannot be replaced by online learning. You have to have real-time, human, nuanced, the smells, everything. And I want that to happen, and again, it's going to need a different sense of community. But coming back, long-winded, you asked me the question, it's my turn, is the way I started it, and the hologenome theory of evolution really is a way of recasting how we think about ourselves and our societies, where it is the community that is us, and the development of a community can make an us a robust performer. So we can look at societies that way, and we can use scientific principles to actually do what amounts to experiments. What would make more robust communities? What would make more resilient? And actually extrapolate from a hologenome in a plant or a microbe, plant or an animal, to a enterprise, a bicycle manufacturing enterprise, a food production chain, whatever you like. So we can look at those for models of how to build more successful enterprises. And the business school drivel that is based around competition as the preeminent rhetorical device, I think is drivel, and I think it's superficial, and I think it's unhelpful. We've had 150 years to look at the dominance paradigm, and now I think it's time we look creatively and not just polemically at cooperativity, and how can we develop a sensible innovation ecosystem that produces the tax base that you desperately need. So, okay.
Thanks for your talk. In the innovation of open source, one of the aphorisms is, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. And yet I've learned to be cautious about analogies from social systems to social ecological systems. To what extent do you think that aphorism applies to open source biotechnology?
Well, you're the engineer, right? You're the guy who confessed? No? Well, it turns out that there's I was going to say a lot of, well, there's some stuff I didn't write about analogies and metaphors. I agree with you. When you're trying to compact 25 years into an hour and a bit, it's hard. But you're absolutely right that it becomes a little trivial and sometimes fatuous to try to shoehorn everything into social policy from a few observations. My observations, I've been pretty deeply associated with the open source software community for the last 10 years anyway, and my observations are that most really successful, substantive open source projects are not the wisdom of the crowds. They're a commitment of a half a dozen people. Almost every major intervention in open source software, the real bulk of the creativity and the real bulk of the sweat has come from a very small number of core committers and architects who design the projects, ranging from the Apache web server to Linux, which of course is well known to those of you who pay attention to Beaverton, to such a hard crowd. Are any of you amongst the 6 million downloads of Firefox 4? No? Yes. Oh, yes. All right. So the same thing with Mozilla. I mean, there's a small number of core committed people who will hang it all out on the line, and that's true with enterprise as well. Small enterprise with anything. I mean, with educators, everybody is not equal. There's some that hang it out. And so what we have to do is make it a little safer for them to do that, And I don't rely on crowdsourcing. I think the majority, I mean, crowds generally are also known as mobs. I mean, a lot of people doing something doesn't make it right. Generally, it makes it wrong. But a small number, lots of small numbers of people with commitment, I think can replace some of those cheesy metaphors. So I don't really, when we went live with the biological open source movement in 2005, in February 11th, I remember, because that's when we got a really good espresso machine at work. A beautiful Electro with a little fascist eagle and stuff on it. We published in Nature magazine the launch of the biological open source movement. Actually, Susan Bragdon was she helped us design some of the legal instruments for that. And it got fantastic press. I mean, we got coverage that day in The Economist and the New York Times and you name it. We just got so much about this thing. We launched this online facility for people to come and help us make these new tools that would bust the Monsanto monopolies. And we built it, and they came and they didn't do anything. It was, scientists will often, with enough libation, tell you that the really most successful experiments are the ones that failed gracefully. Miserably, horribly, but well designed, so they informed you a lot. The biological open source movement is a classic, crash and burn failure from which we learned a huge amount. And the basic issue was that that stuff is really only done by individuals who are really committed. And in communities, is not giving up the individualism. That's so important to appreciate. This isn't, workers of the world unite, grok it all, become, the hive mind, anything but that. It becomes a fertile opportunity for individuals to find solutions. That's what we're trying to achieve. And our biological open source movement faced the systemic dysfunction of the public sector. Everybody in the public sector they talk a lot about, sharing it with the public, but they don't walk the walk because it's really hard to do that stuff. It takes time, and it takes commitment, it takes capital, it takes discipline, and those are not phenomena that are broadly appreciated in the public sector. But that's why the private sector exists, so it can impose managerial discipline on different communities. You've got manufacturers, regulatory people, you've got compliance people, you've got marketers, you've got the R&D staff, all working for Intel or all working for whoever, and they all work for the same company with the same nominal paychecks because you need to put managerial discipline so you can align all this stuff, right? So here we have this fascinating feature that the private sector understands the need to reconcile diverse incentives to make things happen, right? They get it. They really do. And the public sector, where we desperately need it to deal with market failures and weak market signals like the demise of the environment and food systems and health, they don't get it. And in fact, they erect countless barriers to alignment of these incentives amongst diverse groups. So if I'm talking about point of intervention, I don't rail against Monsanto or Dow anymore. I mean, they're a wind-up, ever-ready bunny. They're going to do it. They're going to do what they do. In the absence of a public sector that has GORM, if that could be the opposite of gormless, they're going to behave that way. We need a gormful public sector that can actually do stuff instead of talking about it. So we did the biological open source, and it failed kaboom, and it really was ugly. So that's when we went back down to ground to develop the decision support tool, the LINS. God, I've got to learn how to answer something really short. Yeah, there was yes. Be concise.
You mentioned a few times the competition versus the cooperation, and there's a lot of people thinking in the United States anyway, I'm one of them, that there seems to have been a kind of a cultural shift over the last 30 years or whatever, that we've gone from a society, I mean this is a big generalization, but kind of thinking, well, we're all in this together, to kind of shifting over to, well, you're on your own, kind of a lack of sympathy for those that don't, for the have-nots. I'm just wondering, you live in Australia and you've worked around different places in the world. I guess one, I mean, do you see this shift? I mean, do you agree with this idea that there has been kind of a cultural shift here? And if so, or if not, I mean, do you see this at other places in the world that you've been?
Man, this is so cool to be a guru, and so well paid too, Peter. I'm a little more sanguine about this. I see that the apparent shift, but part of it is a sample error. It's a sample bias because we're getting reported on that. But if in the same time, this 30 years, that transition you're talking about, several interesting seminal events happened in that. One, in the public innovation space, is the development of the Bayh-Dole Act and its various interpretations, which encourage the public sector to privatize and monetize components of its work, whereas previously the default was it was a non-rivalrous commons. So certainly our legal and policy tools over the last 30 years have continued to be knee-jerk precedence of the traceable metric. That's one of the reasons people like to put meets and bounds around things, because you can follow the money. And so you can say, well, you did a good job because you monetize that, even if in the course of that you screwed the ability of anybody to assemble all those pieces into a jigsaw puzzle that matters. So yes, I see that, but look at some of the other things that happened. First, your assertion is true if you happen to look like me. But if you look at what happened around then, was also Civil Rights Act. If you look at the inclusiveness of our policy and legal system to change that has happened, it is deeply troubling to think that we haven't made progress, because we have. In a lot of areas, things are a lot better. More people keep their teeth and live longer and actually have more options for education, even though, sure, we have huge problems. Things aren't worse than they were necessarily. And this chasing after a bucolic used to be is sad and frustrating sometimes, because there's all sorts of things we've done right but too slow. So I think aspirationally, you're absolutely right that we have, as a peoples, I won't say a community, that word's used too much, we don't have a lot of that, but as a people, as a society, we have really become irritatingly intolerant, but structurally, policy and legal environment, we've made strides. So I view that as glass half full thing, where I can say, we've done a bunch of things right, so let's do all the other ones right, which we're not doing. So, no, looking at different parts in the world, I mean, I could say that I'm really happy that we don't have the health system or the gun nuts or the stuff in Australia that you got here. When we had our prime minister, who took over in a bloodbath with the previous prime minister, which wasn't so pretty, but the fact that we had an avowed atheist shacking up with her hairdresser prime minister, nobody cared about any of those things, made me feel good about living in Australia. I mean, yeah, well, she's prime minister. She said, I don't care whether she goes to church or not. And she says, no, I don't. Oh, okay. And I don't care if she has a gun. Nobody does. And so, okay. And I don't care who she lives with. Okay. That felt good. I really liked that. And so there are societies where the stuff that I like is more or less enshrined in the norms and sometimes in the law. And I don't feel that. I mean, I was from these parts originally, and I don't feel that comfortable when I come back to the States for those reasons. But for other reasons, I mean, the ferment of exciting ideas and the ability to take chances and fail, that's sort of the other side of this balance. And it's really kind of interesting, because rough and tumble and ugly and mean has on its other side agile and fun and edgy. And it's really hard to find a culture that is, sort of like Canada Plus. Like it's like all the niceness of Canada, but fun. and I kind of thought Australia would be that way when I moved there, but it's not. Animals are great, though. But all the plants and animals try to kill you there. So it's like, I guess that could be a form of fun. It's like Australia, it's like Canada with none of the survivability. So, we just had floods where I live in Brisbane. It was just really cool, unless you're one of the businesses that literally went under. But everybody remembered that there were bull sharks. I mean, bull sharks in the streets of Brisbane. There's a suburb called Goodna, which was 2 meters underwater, and there were 2.5, 3 meter long sharks in the main street. It was just so cool when you're traveling internationally. People say, oh, are you from the place that has sharks in the main street? Oh, yeah, it's us. It's just Australia. We take it for granted. Yeah, crocodile took my friend, but yeah, it's a really great country to be from. Just not always in. Sorry. Okay, next one, short, I promise.
So there's a whole lot of different studies that have happened. I keep reading about whether conventional, organic, or versus organic farming. What will feed the world when it is 9 billion people. My interpretation of what you said, where you can't just change one thing and expect the whole community to improve, is that that's kind of the conventional side. Okay, we'll make something resistant to this one disease, and that'll make everything better. But there are 10 million others out there. So when you say that your vision of the future of farming is more like a community-based and that microbiologists work in on that, my interpretation seems to be like an organic farmer with a microbiologist on staff. How do you expand upon that if that is completely off base? And also, how do you work into that system, preventing the kind of mistakes that we have made with conventional farming of thinking, oh, we can just add ammonia to the soil and everything will be better forever, when you are still, messing with the system that has evolved together over this long amount of time?
Okay, well, it's a great question that doesn't lend itself to a short answer, but I can say that Mark Twain, Bernard Shaw, I'm sorry I don't have time to write you a short one, so here's the long one. We're not going to be able to prevent the problems. What we can do is develop a system that decreases the impact and decreases the recovery time. That's the nature of resilience. Resilience doesn't mean that you don't break links all the time. It just means they reform and they heal. So a resilient system is not one that avoids mistakes. It's a one that actually tolerates them very well. So to develop a resilient agricultural system doesn't mean you've got to get it right. It means you put a system in place where when you do get it wrong, it fixes itself, or it can be fixed very, very rapidly and often in an instructive way. So I don't think that the mentality of we're going to fix the problem is very helpful. Parenthetically, I also think that the artificial tension between organic and chemical as also polarizing the community into the artisanal and the scientific is unhelpful. My sense is that my view is a truly good organic farmer is somebody that is extremely scientific, actually, by understanding, observing, building an experience case that can cause a prediction to be made. One of the problems with artisanal farming, talking about traditional knowledge, one of the downsides of traditional knowledge is it's not extensible. It works there. It works there, then. What general principles do you learn from that that works there, when? The challenge is to migrate from the sensitivity to place that has lent itself to the better form organic agriculture to a sensitivity to place that's transportable to new systems and new paradigms. So I find that the foaming rhetoric about organic versus chemical to be incredibly misleading. I sense that a systems-based transferable knowledge that actually honors the integrity of context, that says this matters where you are, and that there's potential, often very great latent potential in where you are, that's different in where she is. That's going to be the scientific future of agriculture. But as I said before, both whether it be Birkenstocks or hobnail boots, you turn around for a year, you come back to a weed patch. They all require intense human management. And so the question is that going to be human management that has certain respect for place, or is it going to be human management that tries to make place like the other one? So a sensible way to view this is that much of industrialized agriculture seeks to homogenize the environment and then make a plant breeding or a crop system that works in that homogenized environment. It turns into a model system, as scientists would say. And it breeds for that, and it's successful. In the constraints of that system, it is successful. You cannot argue with the numbers. They work. They're not robust, they're not resilient, they're not very much fun, and they don't cause substantial employment, which is a huge issue in the world. So you can say, okay, the numbers work, but they're probably the wrong numbers, dog, lick thing. So I guess the issue is, I won't be drawn personally into a debate about organic versus conventional. I don't think we need the conventional. We need science-driven new types of agriculture. So, for those of you who are Tony Blair fans, it's a third way. For those of you who know of Tony Blair, it's nothing like his third way. The idea is we do need a science-driven, humane, context-dependent, but science-driven development. It must not be artisanal. It must not be cow horns facing north and clapping and dancing twice. And people charge a premium for a lot of that stuff. Fine, if you want to put your money into cow horns north and stuff, okay. But ultimately, we need really, really resilient systems that we don't have many examples of. And when people look to traditional agriculture, much of traditional agriculture is incredibly crappy. It really is. I mean, I spent so much of my life in a lot of the places where agriculture is hardscrabble. It's an ugly, hard life. Much traditional agriculture uses biological weed control called children. And your point about this is interesting because the single most common correlation with bad agriculture is bad education. Because when throughout much of Africa where I've worked, children are very, very useful to weed, because weeds are a huge problem in agriculture. And if you've got children who can go out and weed, what are they not doing? Going to school. What are they not doing? They're not having free time to imagine, to do interesting things and be a creative force in your country. So it's a terribly difficult question you ask, because there's no simple answers except that if we imagine that it was this wonderful green halcyon thing on the side of a milk carton, that it was all lovely in the olden days in agriculture, you've never been there. It's really hard. And it's hard to do it, it's hard to keep it going, and we need to learn ways to make it less hard. But that doesn't mean pouring on stuff in a homogeneous environment. But this issue of children is really important. And coming back to it, I mean, don't want to suck up to your great question, but the point is, most of the world, children are labor. And as long as that's the case, they are not creative parts of our burgeoning society. So we have to have agricultural methods that actually continue to develop employment, because actually getting people unemployed in agriculture is insane. You've got, what, 700 million people in the agricultural sector in India? What are you going to do if they stop working? So you have to make it more humane, make it so children can be properly educated. So, boy, oh boy, we're rabbiting on. This was supposed to be the short answer. So, okay, so. Oh, there's one more. Okay, one more.
Really short answer.
This time, I promise, I'll cut myself off. 42.
Yes, I have only one question. You've described systems that desirable systems as being resilient and surviving. One of the overall observations of society that now, at least this country, and I expect the rest of the world, is that we're developing a great concentration of economic wealth. Would you apply the principles you have in mind to the stability of that system and its ability to survive?
Yes. Oh, I'd love to go on about it, but yes. Yes. Thank you very much for coming.